There are frequent misunderstandings in online video game debates surrounding post-launch monetization, and I wanted to weigh in on the topic of the difference between DLC and microtransactions. Let's chat about it down below, but first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. Language is a very important thing. Words have meaning, of course, but the meaning we assign them does change over time and with societal movements. Online, however, they can often take on a meaning completely absent of logical progression. And given I just recently talked about microtransactions as linked to company profits and online debate, it seems like a good time to talk about the differences between what I feel is good post-launch monetization and what is bad post-launch monetization. People use DLC and microtransactions almost interchangeably in many cases, and as distinct things in others. The first problem that you run into immediately in looking at microtransactions and DLC, however, is that they're completely unrelated terms. Microtransaction refers only to the size of the payment, completely ignoring the content aspect, while downloadable content, or DLC, explicitly states content which requires an internet connection to transmit and says nothing about how valuable that content might be. And that distinction is rather important, because one is a focus on money, the other is a focus on the content itself. When a game is released, what you will find is that in general, there are two main ways that post-launch monetization occurs. Each way may have variants, but the core premise is the same. Either a company will provide something new to the game that wasn't there before, whether that be something as simple as a reskinned weapon or as complex as a full story expansion. Or they will allow the player to pay in order to avoid the expenditure of time. By way of example, Blood and Wine is a story expansion for The Witcher 3. It's offered as a one-time payment and sold on the merits of expanding the story of the game, and it falls in the first post-launch monetization method. But the opposing example would be something like Shadow of War, where you're offered specific in-game units for a cost, which involves gambling loot boxes. It's not so much the addition of content as it is avoidance of a time sink. But even if it wasn't loot boxes and you were buying orcs themselves individually, they're still not adding something new to the game that you're buying. It's all part of the existing game systems. This starts to get a little complicated when you consider a game like Hearthstone, where new content is indeed added to the game in the form of new cards. But it's added whether you want it or not, teasing the player with its existence and subsequently gated behind a pseudo-gambling mechanic. Those cards will be used against you, whether you've padded your collection out or not. So if you buy packs, are you really getting new content? Or are you just saving an expenditure of time because you could unlock them all if you play enough? Over the past 15 years, we've seen a remarkable shift from the first position to the second, from being provided genuine content to being provided much smaller content, and finally, what can barely be considered content at all. Long gone are the days of standalone expansions, where a development team would sequester themselves away for months or years to develop a large-scale addition to a game which would then be packaged in a box and sold on a store shelf for usually 2/3 of the base product. And to some, that's a good thing. Those games would often receive support for a year or two, and then when the next iteration of Windows came out, it was up to the community to patch the game to keep it working because support was done. The Blizzards of the world, with their 20 years of support of an old game, were not the norm by any stretch. That shift has moved to much more long-reaching products, more frequent and smaller pieces of new content because of a desire to even out some of the spending and keep customers engaged with a particular business's line. It was no good to have customers only buy something from your company once a year. Rather, if they could receive new input funding every 6 months, or even more frequently, it meant that they could budget more accurately and justify increased spending on games. So it's no surprise when Strauss Zelnick, the CEO of Take-Two Interactive, says that effectively every game they produce will have recurrent consumer spending from here on. By going to smaller, more frequent pieces of content, though, game developers and publishers are fundamentally changing the value proposition. Is a skin a worthwhile investment? At what price is it worthwhile? If you spend $60 on a video game, are you really getting $5 worth of enjoyment if you pay that much for a skin? These are all very subjective individual questions for each person to answer for themselves. However, chances are that this value proposition is pretty shallow for most people on the small-scale content side of the coin, which is why most of the companies offering skins are moving towards blind box loot crates. They know that money for a skin isn't worthwhile for most people, that most gamers have no interest in paying as much as developers have historically tried to charge for these things. Blizzard used to sell characters and skins for Heroes of the Storm, and it obviously wasn't doing well enough because that got turfed in relatively short order in favor of loot boxes. They had to do it, because manipulation is the most successful way to get people to buy a bad value proposition. Based on all of this confusing, nonsensical language where DLC and microtransactions are conflated, I would propose a new set of terms which I think manage to describe the situation accurately. You're either sold content or you're sold anti-content. And in my view, breaking it out this way rather clearly identifies the motives and ethics of the seller as well as what the product is. You're either sold something new that you can genuinely determine whether the value proposition is worthwhile for the cost, like buying a can of pop at the grocery store. You can see the price and decide whether you're willing to pay that price for that product. Or you're provided a showcase of things that are in the game which you cannot access, either because they're gated in such a way that cash is the only way to access them for yourself, or the game is balanced in such a way that acquiring them is intentionally designed to be a chore. Imagine if stores did that, where the free carts could only carry a small amount of stuff, but they sold you temporary access to a bigger cart. It is really that simple, but it's also extremely important. When I make an argument online, for example, and call into question the ethics of microtransactions, there will inevitably be people who will see that argument and wonder why I have a problem with them buying a song in Rock Band for $1. When in actual fact, I have very little if any problem with that system at all, because you're buying a known item for a known price. Or when I talk about supporting developer DLC, and someone inevitably will talk about all of the great DLC in CSGO. A game that in my opinion is one of the most ethically bankrupt games ever made, precisely because of the ability to cash out your wins for Steam credit, which has real-world value and is in my view the literal definition of unregulated gambling. This is why definitions and words have the importance they do, to prevent those misunderstandings of intent. So, back to what I see as the correct terminology. Content is being given something new and being able to buy it. Call it post-launch content, monetized content, downloadable content, prestige, ultra-limited, stealth, epic, iconic content. It doesn't really matter. Content simply means that something new has been added and you can get it for a cost between 0 and infinite. The developer can choose the cost and you can choose to pay the cost, and in exchange for some predetermined amount of currency, you get that content. Anti-content is then precisely the opposite. When a developer is selling you the ability to progress faster, they have provided no new content. They're just charging you to access existing content. All they've done is designed a game tedious enough to make you want to skip it, and let's not pretend that this is an accident. When a game has timers like Dungeon Keeper Mobile, or countless other iOS and Android titles, but allows you to pay to skip them, have they sold you any content? Not by a long shot. When they patch in a load of new skins and other players become an advertising platform for those new skins, did you really buy that skin, or did you get teased into gambling to stop it from being locked behind the tedious, grindy progression gate? And to be perfectly frank, I think we've long since moved past the point where the term microtransaction has any value. It's not a microtransaction if you buy $30 of in-game currency, regardless of how slowly you spend that in-game currency after buying it. Microtransaction is a very minimizing term, and that's why they started using it in game marketing. It makes people think that small costs are involved, so it doesn't matter, when it's not like that at all, with both Take-Two and Ubisoft posting such enormous parts of their revenue coming from recurrent consumer spending. It's also important to understand that simply by virtue of something being content doesn't mean that the value proposition is actually good. It's entirely possible to have genuine content on offer that is priced too high or the quality is too poor. The individual needs to be able to make that decision for themselves whether or not to purchase. You can go all the way back to Horse Armor in Oblivion for this. It cost you about $2.50 worth of Xbox Live points to buy armor for your horse. And in my view, and many others, that's terrible value. From a microtransaction and DLC perspective, it happens to fall under both categories. But from a content anti-content perspective, it's clearly offering new content. It also doesn't have certain ethical pitfalls because the player is never tricked into a purchase. The reason why all of this is so important is because gamers every day are fighting with each other over misunderstandings of terminology, and frankly, the game industry marketing teams love it. Microtransactions can apply to small-scale new content just as easily as gold bars in Candy Crush. DLC is as useful at describing both something simple like a pre-order bonus or as complex as the remaster of Modern Warfare 2 when it was a bundle with Infinite Warfare. They're equally nebulous as to cause problems. At the end of the day, however, I think that the most logical way to describe any post-launch monetization is by referring directly to exactly what the player gets in exchange for money. If all you get is to reclaim a few minutes, hours, days, weeks of your life by skipping gameplay or grinding, then you certainly aren't buying content. I've always been of the belief that language matters, and while I know that words can change meaning over time, it's especially accelerated by the constant barrage of the internet, it does seem to me that gamers could use something of an agreed-upon lexicon because so many arguments and debates involve confusion because of the words we use. What do you think about DLC versus microtransactions, content versus anti-content? Let's chat about it in the comments below. Feature Creep is a regular segment on the channel, and if you like the idea of chatting about this kind of stuff, I've got a Discord link in the description. And as an added item of interest, we often discuss ideas for the kinds of topics that folks might like to see me cover in Patreon Backer Chat, because Feature Creep is entirely funded by gamers. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Tarmack. That's all I have to say.